Being energizing AGOA agriculture trade. My name is Patrick Wilson. They call me Dr. Pat or Dr. Patrick. But today we're going to do something extremely important and extremely beneficial, which is we're going to share with you information. As you know, information is power. And we're going to assure that you leave here empowered. Before I begin the session, I'd like to share with you two administrative features today. Rick and David, their presentations will be provided to you at the conclusion of the panel outside the hall. Secondly, after this panel, we will break for lunch. So if you begin to get antsy, you won't, because we will break promptly after having given you all of this information. Let me begin. Matter of fact, I'm going to sit over here so that we can have a more collegial atmosphere as opposed to me being on the podium. Let me begin with a few comments that were made today earlier to enhance the information sharing. Senator Cardin referenced tariffs. We have an expert here that's going to talk about tariffs and how they impact on all of us. Greg mentioned DDT being banned from export to the United States. Consider two important factors with respect to DDT. DDT is regulated by two agencies. One, it's regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, meaning that they will analyze the product to see if the levels are met or if they're not met. The agency that sets these levels is EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. And you're going to be hearing a lot of acronyms. And what I want you to do is raise your hand if you're not sure, because all of us having a great deal of experience with government, we are at ease with throwing around acronyms. So if you don't know what the acronyms are, raise your hand and ask. We will try to define them as we go along. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, FDA, Food and Drug Administration. The reason why I mention those two is because while a product is detained for containing DDT, a banned substance, you can go to EPA and find a equivalent pesticide that is acceptable. So you don't have to do this individually. Mr. Matunga stated that information not getting to small and medium-sized entrepreneurs or businesses, and there is a need as a result of that, there is a need to disseminate this information, making sure that it goes to the government, but also to the SMEs in country. So that's one thing that we can do and we can recommend. How to make this happen? One thing you should think about is governments are not going to turn something over unless they're going to get something in return. Businesses can be registered. There's an income revenue coming in from businesses. So if your government is thinking in terms of some type of revenue, there is a system that could be fostered as a business registration process. If you do this electronically, that will reduce corruption. Also, taxes. There's also a taxation vehicle, but the taxation could be funded through different avenues. So if you show that there's a resource income, revenue income, then there's possibility that the governments would be more likely to assist you in your directions. There was a comment from Abuja that said we need more investment. What I encourage you to think about is not just ask for investment. Just say in addition to the investment, what it's going to be used for, who it's going to, and how much you're looking for. Let's do a paradigm shift as to investment. Because if you say investment, you'll get money, but where is it going to go? How is it going to be used? Information that's going to be shared here is going to give you some ideas of how you can apply or where you can apply those monies. There was a comment with respect to corruption, AIDS, and poverty. How many conferences have you been to where you hear, in Africa-related conferences, where you hear corruption, poverty, AIDS? Everyone. A little secret. There's corruption, poverty, and AIDS in the United States. The difference is that the United States have Madison Avenue, which is up in New York City, and we sell and we walk on water. We need a marketing paradigm shift, whereas you talk positively about Africa. You say, yes, we have corruption, poverty, and AIDS, but we also have this. Yes, we have corruption, poverty, AIDS, but we also have this. So let's do a paradigm shift in talking positive about Africa, talking positive about your countries. The major problem is you don't know what you don't know. Let me repeat that. You don't know what you don't know. So what type of questions are you going to ask? Who are you going to meet? What type of infrastructures are you going to develop and why? This panel drills down on those questions and answers those questions, and we're going to have ample amount of time to address those. Rules and regulations and recipes. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk specifically when we say rules and regulations, we're talking about asking the right questions by being empowered with the right information, presenting your products and services to customers, effective market development strategies. What do trade regulations, standards, and guidelines mean to you? We're going to talk about tariffs. There was a statement that someone referenced SPS. What is SPS? How does that impact on you? Sanitary, phytosanitary. Yeah, well, that sounds good. We have an expert here that will talk about SPS and how it impacts on you. We have an expert here that talks about tariffs, how that impacts on you. And the first line of defense for the United States is Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS. That's the first line of defense for the United States. Someone mentioned cut flowers. Well, it's not easy to get involved in cut flowers because APHIS will tell you what you can and what you can't export. And there are programs. These programs will take 3 to 4 years to get to that level. Are you at that level? Are you export ready? You'll hear that today as well. Let me go into a little bit of the definitions of the regulation, rules, and recipes. And then I'm going to introduce my esteemed panelists. Regulations. You look at regulations as chess pieces. Rules. Those are the chess moves, and recipes. Those are the chess strategies for agricultural sustainability. No more checkers. Chess. Strategizing, planning your business plans, thinking who you need to talk to, who you need to get funding from, and why. No one, no bank in the United States or in country is going to give you money unless you can show how you're going to pay it back with interest. Regulations, who to know and why. United States Food and Drug Administration, United States Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, EPA. US FDA. If your product is not a meat or poultry, everything else is regulated by FDA. Vegetables, canned, processed, seafood, milk, all regulated by FDA. Now, without that information, you're dead in the water. Let's say if you're going to export coffee, and you go and you talk to people at USDA. They say, well, that's fine. Sounds good to me. And you've gone through APHIS, and they say, that's fine. Sounds good to me. And then you export your product to the United States, and it's stopped at the port of entry. And it's stopped by, not USDA, it's stopped by FDA, because they're the regulating body for coffee. So know who the players are. Department of Commerce. Department of Commerce, in each embassy in country, there is a Department of Commerce person. Or there is someone that can refer you to a Department of Commerce person in the United States. The reason why I'm saying that is you need, in country, to introduce yourself to them. Let's say this gentleman right here is going to export seafood. This gentleman contacts me. I'm going to buy his seafood. I'm going to buy all of your seafood, every bit of your seafood. And if you can get more seafood, I'll buy that too. But before I do that, I'm going to call the embassy in your country. And I'm going to say, do you know Mr. A? And if the person come back and say, no, I don't know Mr. A, that's going to make me a little leery on doing business with you, because if nobody knows you, how am I going to trust you? So take the time to introduce yourself, so that if I call and I say, do you know Mr. A? They're going to say, yes, I know Mr. A. He does this and this and this. EPA, I mentioned EPA already, and that's the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, recipes, business plans. You can start your business without a business plan, but it would behoove you to develop a business plan as you're going along the way, because in order to get investment, someone is going to say, well, what type of business plan do you have? And if you say, well, what's a business plan? Then it's going to be very, very far in between before you get that type of money. You have to rush back and show them how you're going to pay their money back. That's in a business plan. Buyers. Need to identify buyers in the United States. If you don't have a partner in the United States, or if you don't have a mechanism in the United States to identify a buyer, then you're going to start your business and you're going to hope to find a buyer. So ideally, you can identify a buyer. Electricity. All that I've said, processing, all that I've said is meaningless if you don't have electricity, if you don't have renewable energy. You have to have some source to keep your product moving. Laboratories. There's a difference between laboratories. There's a regulatory laboratory and then there's a research laboratory. What we're talking about here are regulatory laboratories. Laboratories that can analyze your product and tell you if there's any deleterious component in your product. If you wait, or if you don't have a regulatory laboratory in country, and you wait until you export your product to the United States and it's detained, and we're asking you to identify a private laboratory, most of your profit is gone in paying for a private laboratory to do the work. So regulatory laboratories, I would encourage you to consider. Going back to rules, WTO, World Trade Organization, TBT, Technical Barriers to Trade, SPS, Sanitary Phytosanitary, TRQ, Tariff Rate Quotas, Bioterrorism, HACCP, that's HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. We'll talk more about that. GMP, Good Manufacturing Procedures. GLP, Good Laboratory Procedures. FAO, that's a Foreign Agriculture Organization. That's the UN Food Branch. They're located in Rome. And the Pharmaceutical Branch is located in Geneva. But when we're talking about foods, let's talk about FAO. And the reason why I mention FAO is because every country in Africa that I visited, I heard the response as, yes, we're HACCP ready. Yes, we're export ready. Why? Because we meet ISO standards. The United States doesn't care too much about ISO standards. It's good to have it in place, but we want to make sure you meet United States standards. So it behooves you to understand what those standards and regulations are, in addition to knowing what ISO is. But basically, know what FDA standards, rules, and regulations are. With that, let me provide you with some introductions. Richard Pascoe has been practicing agricultural law for 25 years. He primarily provides counseling to farm organizations and food companies on agricultural and trade legislation, regulations, and policy approaches. He has a wealth of experience working with Congress, the United States Congress. And just a note here, this is United States Congress. You should piggyback that with your respective legislatures. Because if you have comparable systems, that will move the process quicker. The U.S. Department of Agriculture and U.S. Trade Representative, USTR. Quick segue, when I mention technical barriers to trade, that's what we're talking about, what we have been talking about since 2000 to the present, 2010. We're talking about technical barriers to trade. But we don't talk about the sister to technical barriers to trade. That's SPS, Sanitary Phytosanitary. You can lower and remove all the taxes and tariffs you want, but if you don't meet the standards of each country, you're dead in the water. He has and besides USTR, the U.S. International Trade Commission. He has played a key role in advancing agricultural program and trade reforms, as well as environmental guidelines and food safety and nutrition legislation. Prior to joining the law firm of McLeod, Watkinson, and Miller, Mr. Pascoe served as Vice President of Government Affairs for a major livestock trade association and as agricultural legislative assistant for a former ranking member of the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. You have three major parts in that: agriculture, nutrition, and forestry. He currently serves on the Agricultural Technical Advisory Committee for Trade in Tobacco, Cotton, Peanuts, and Planting Seeds. He was also previously appointed by the Secretary of Agriculture to serve on the Agricultural Technical Advisory Committee for Trade in Livestock and Livestock Products and the National Advisory Council for Commodity Distribution. Livestock, beef. Who regulates beef? USDA, correct. David Scully. David Scully is an agricultural economist specializing in international agricultural trade and agricultural policy analysis. He serves as an economist with the USDA's Economic Research Service from 1980 to 2005. If you're with an agency that long, you have information to share. you should grab onto somebody that's within a federal government agency for as long, any time it's more than 10 years, you have a jewel.
Me too.
We'll get to
Although I know I look a lot younger.
Where he worked on a variety of topics, including WTO, World Trade Organization, and agricultural trade-related issues, agricultural policy reform in Latin America, North Africa, and Oceania, the impact and political economy of food aid, and the problems of food self-sufficiency in sub-Saharan Africa. So we have regional thinking here. We have expertise regionally. Since retiring from U.S. government service, he has been a senior Fulbright scholar in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where he lectured in Brock University's economic department and helped develop the research program at the university's Institute of Governance Studies. He is currently engaged in teaching and research at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, and recently consulted with FAO on the issue of non-distorting agricultural support in OECD countries. OECD.
Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development.
Did you hear that?
It's the rich countries.
And more, loud.
Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
And what else did you say about it?
It's the rich country club.
Okay.
Basically. Not the country club, it's the club of rich countries, industrialized countries primarily.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what we want is African countries to join the rich club.
Right.
Craig Fedchuk, who is still a government employee with many years. Mr. Fedchuk is currently the Director of International Capacity Development, following a year of service as the Associate Executive Director of the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS, first line of defense for the United States. Plant Protection and Quarantine Division, PPQ, Plant Health Programs. So, if you have cut flowers and you want to export cut flowers to the United States, you need to talk to APHIS people. If there is a Mediterranean fly incident in your region, you need to know that, because the United States will not allow your products into the United States. You need to talk to an APHIS person. So when you visit the embassy in country, there are two people you want to talk to. You want to talk to an APHIS person, and you want to talk to a Department of Commerce person, amongst everybody else, to introduce yourself. But make sure you meet those two individuals. Mr. Fedchuk served as Director of APHIS PPQ Phytosanitary Issues Management, SPS. Staff for 2.5 years, leading all plant-related trade negotiations. Before joining PIM in July 2006, Mr. Fedchuk was the Director of Bilateral SPS Affairs at the Executive Office of the President, Office of the United States Trade Representative, Chief of Staff for APHIS International Services, and the Director of Asia Trade Policy in the APHIS International Services Trade Support Team. While at USTR, he was the lead negotiator for the United States on sanitary and phytosanitary issues in Free Trade Agreement negotiations, FTA, Free Trade Agreement negotiations, with Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Panama, as well as World Trade Organization accessions discussions with Russia, Vietnam, Ukraine, among others. Before joining APHIS, Mr. Fedchuk worked in the Codex Office of the Food Safety and Inspection Service and the U.S. Department. Let me go back to Codex. That's Codex Office of the Food Safety and Inspection Service. A lot of your ministers and ministries have representatives that travel to Rome to participate in the Codex activity. But with this information, you should encourage the voice to be greater, because usually at the Codex Alimentarius meetings in Rome, the participation of African countries is not as great as we would want want it to be. He also served as a Russian linguist in the United States Army. Mr. Fedchuk is a graduate of, I won't do those particulars. I'll save those particulars for your reading. With that, let me have I would like to have the extreme pleasure to introduce our first panelist to give a talk on drilling down on what we are speaking of today. Mr. Richard Pashko.
Yes, I want to thank Dr. Wilson and our host for sponsoring this year's event. My intent is to frame the issues and provide some key details for AGOA countries seeking access to exporting horticultural products to the U.S. The first thing I want to do, though, before I get started, is I want to commend Africa for hosting a wonderful World Cup and congratulate the three AGOA country teams, South Africa, Ghana, and Cameroon, for fielding very competitive teams. In fact, Ghana was maybe a little too competitive in beating the U.S. One reason I mention soccer is because it puts AGOA in perspective. AGOA is really analogous to a playing field. It gives African countries the opportunity, and that's actually in the name AGOA, to compete in the U.S. market. That's what it does. But to be successful in competing, it's just like a soccer team. You've got 11 different players at least, and those players include USDA's APHIS, USDA's Foreign Agriculture Service, USAID, FDA, USTR, Congress, International Plant Protection Convention, National Plant Protection Organizations, private sector, regional authorities, NGOs, many others. Each of those players have a role. Some are defense, some are offense, some are midfielders. APHIS, our speaker later, he would be analogous to the goalie. Their job is to protect U.S. agriculture from pests and disease. Looking at the numbers, and I think it's always important to put AGOA and its success in perspective. In terms of all the agricultural products we import in the United States every year, only 1% comes from the 38 AGOA countries. So, as a soccer coach, that's opportunity. It shows we have a lot of work to do. If you look at the details on AGOA, just in the years since we've had AGOA passed, we've increased the amount of exports by roughly $260-some million. So we got a long ways to go. And you look at 14 AGOA countries, less than $1 million in 2009 in terms of their ag exports. My focus today is horticultural products. Even that it's valued at $210 million. And that, to me, is very low if you look at what we get from both Mexico and Canada. The horticultural exports are about $10 billion a year. You look at Central America, South America, same sorts of numbers in the billions. So what are horticultural products? I threw this slide together, and I need to correct something on here, but it's really for APHIS purposes. It's fresh fruits and vegetables, tree nuts, cut flowers, nursery products. And then you go down farther down the list, wine and beer, fruit juices. Those are really processed foods. They're not really, and for APHIS purposes, they're not horticultural products, but for FAS purposes, they are, and that's why I have them on the slide. So again, some of the most immediate players for our purposes, for my presentation, APHIS, it's a regulatory agency. Their job, it's a mission, and this is what they have to do by law. They have to protect U.S. plant health from diseases and pests. So they've got a big job. FDA is the regulatory agency. It's different. It protects U.S. food safety. Okay? So once you have a product that's processed, it's under the jurisdiction of FDA. AMS is another player. Maybe I call it a defender because you've got U.S. grade standards for different fruits and vegetables in terms of shapes and size. FAS, maybe you can call them a midfielder. They lead capacity efforts. USAID, midfielder, they provide efforts to backstop, to give you the opportunity to have success. And really it comes down to, at the end of the day, you've got to have both the government, your government, and your private sector pushing very hard to achieve access. I'm not going to go through all this detail because it gets pretty specific, but just to know there's two regulations within APHIS. One is for fruits and vegetables, cut flowers, and the way it works is you've got imports are prohibited unless you go through a process that involves pest risk analysis, risk mitigation factors, et cetera. And then you have another regulation that's for live plants. It's actually easier to gain access under that provision for live plants. So in fact, we do import some AGOA plants that are live plants. So this is the process. And as I said, the first thing that happens after one of your governments makes a request to ship, say, tomatoes from your country to the U.S., then they've got to prove through a procedure which is identifying the pests, rate the risk of the pests that are associated with a particular commodity. So that's a process that APHIS does with working with your countries directly. The next step after you've identified and rated these pests is you've got to determine what sort of risk mitigation measures can make sure to the U.S. government that in fact you don't introduce those pests in the United States. And they can be several things, and Craig can give you a lot more detail, but just for an example, you might have a pre-harvest or post-harvest inspection. You might cut fruit. You might have to have a packing house. There's all sorts of things you can do that would be a required mitigation measure that APHIS would require. So you have this process that typically takes, and the numbers are across the board, but roughly if you're in rulemaking, it's at least 2 years. And when I say rulemaking is the Department of Agriculture will put out a rule saying, this pest or this commodity from this country is seeking access, and so it's a public comment period for U.S. industry and other players to submit comments and make recommendations. And so this process can be lengthy because what happens is if your government is not very good at replying to information requests, and this back and forth, it can take a very long time. And it's not just proposing a regulation, it's also having people at the White House, OMB, looking at the regulations to make sure that they comply with their requirements. So anyway, again, I'm kind of in the weeds here. Dr. Wilson said detail. Maybe there's too much detail. But one thing to APHIS's credit, in 2007, they came up with this notice-based alternative to the formal rulemaking that can take 2 years to several years. This notice-based process is simply putting a notice out and have people comment. And this is for situations where there's not a whole lot of pest risk. For example, blueberries from South Africa was notice-based, and so that was a very, very quick process. And so that period for that, a notice-based system is about 18 months. So anyway, in the paper, and there's a lot of detail there, I looked at, and this is information provided by APHIS, but just try to get a sampling of what happened in various commodities. And go back to Zambia, June 2001, they had a request on baby squash and courgettes. One of the first vegetables considered under AGOA. Okay, what happened? I mean, this is a new process for a new situation for APHIS, dealing with AGOA countries, et cetera. Well, it took about 7 years, and I don't know the details of why it took 7 years, but it took 7 years. Since then, as I mentioned before, in 2007, APHIS came forward with a notice-based process. And so we have a much different situation with baby carrots and corn from Kenya. They were granted access 2 years, 7 months. And that application actually started in 2005, but the fact that they had this process that made it go much faster. And I think in the future that would even be quicker than that. The one thing that I want to get into a lot of detail, but the other agency, FDA, they have lots of requirements when you look at food safety of products. Under the U.S. Bioterrorism Act, you've got to register your facilities. You've got to provide advance notice if you're having a shipment. That's something that's pretty important in these times. And then you also have a legislation pending in Congress, and I won't bore you with the details, but the bottom line is that there's going to be more regulation and more requirements that you're going to face. Right now, there's a House bill that's been passed, a Senate bill that's going to be maybe even come up in the next few weeks. But there's kind of good news, bad news. For example, the Senate bill, it's going to have a foreign supplier verification program. It's going to include lot-by-lot certification, all sorts of things. But on the other hand, it also provides for some capacity building for foreign governments. Okay, Dr. Wilson talked about a recipe, so I stole his idea about recipe to make this easier, and so I put it on a slide. He's exactly right. Develop a business plan. You really need to, I think before you start, you need to have a market feasibility study to determine whether there's demand in the U.S. for the product. I think looking at a lot of the commodities where countries have made a request, and I think a great example is tomatoes, and I know countries have tomato requests pending, but reality is we have production in this country. We have Mexico that ships lots of tomatoes here. So if you're picking winners and losers, that might be a tougher one. Now, maybe there's something unique about the tomatoes that you're going to be shipping that's it's a different variety that you can and have a niche market, but I don't know the details of that. So that's really important before you even get started. The other thing is the infrastructure. Dr. Wilson talked about this. One thing I don't have on that I need to add is clean water. It's not just electricity, roads, transportation, but you've got to have clean water, especially with the new FDA law, expanded law. If you don't have clean water, you're not going to pass food safety standards. And then really, it's not enough for the government to make applications to APHIS, have import approval requests. You really have to have the private sector engaged, and you've got to have the ability, the infrastructure to, once you have a product approved, you've got to be able to continue to carry out risk mitigation that's going to go in perpetuity. In fact, there are situations, Bactria invadens there's been a major outbreak. 33 African countries have it. So you're going to have more standards and more things you're going to have to do from a mitigation perspective. And then I just add at the end, okay, you do all these things, you still have to have a marketing plan. You probably need to have a promotion program. You should look at seasonal sales opportunities. I think the best example to describe this is, let's take avocados. We have U.S. avocado producers. They can produce during certain seasons, but there are seasons where they can't produce, so they get avocados from Mexico and Chile in the off-season. And so those countries are able to supply the market when U.S. growers can't. That's something that, being in the Southern Hemisphere, AGOA countries should look at opportunities to provide out of season for the U.S. I think that's one thing to look at. Other recommendations, and this is just so important, I mentioned already, but you've got to have the framework, you've got to have the staff. Really, it goes back to you're probably tired of my soccer analogy, but you've got to have those people that are trained to make this happen. If you're going to have an ongoing market, it's one thing to get approval, but it's another thing to have a sustainable market. And then the other thing is very important, and I stole this idea from Craig, an earlier presentation, but you really need to follow up with APHIS. They have lots and lots of requests. And so the people that are on their case, following through, being responsive, asking questions, their approvals are going to go a lot faster. The other thing, and this is more my background, is that going back to that playing field, AGOA is a preferential situation. That's the playing field. FTAs, I think, maybe it's better. There's more opportunity to develop infrastructure. So that's something that I think African countries should really consider that, even though SACU has been on hold for quite some time. I won't go into all these details, but because Craig will probably talk about this, but just quickly to show what APHIS is up against. As of July 8th, just this month, they're evaluating, they've got 113 PRAs they're looking at. 23 involve AGOA countries, and so that's a lot of work in itself to work through that. So recommendations, APHIS could maybe devote more resources and staff to processing import approval requests. And what I'm not saying is that they change their philosophy, and it's not going to change that they're going to try to protect U.S. agriculture, but maybe a small percent, and maybe they do this informally, that maybe part of their work can be focused on focusing on AGOA approvals. So quickly to move on here, capacity building. The other thing I think most of you are aware, but just to let you know, if you're not, that in 2003, USDA and USAID, they announced a joint program to place USDA advisors East, West, and Southern Africa. And these advisors initially were focused on doing PRAs. But since then, I think there's been a learning curve. And so now they're looking at something broader than PRAs, but actually helping strengthen your SPS systems. So I think that's been a real positive. And I can give you the details of the success, but Craig can talk about that too. And then USAID, they are the funder. They have the resources, and then they need to obviously make sure they coordinate with their counterparts in the U.S. government and with AGOA countries. Let me go ahead and conclude there. And obviously, I know a little bit about the meat side too, Food Safety Inspection Service, but that was not part of my report. But obviously, we're available for questions, and Craig can answer those too. Thank you.
To those of you who are taking notes, and I know who you are, I will not call upon you to answer questions. But those who are not taking notes, beware. I'm going to point you out and call and ask you, what about this? Let me just say, processed foods, FSIS requires HACCP plans. Meat and poultry, FSIS, USDA. For FDA, seafood and juices require HACCP plans. Bioterrorism Act, there are 4 components. Authorization number, you need an authorization number in advance before you engage in having your products come to the shores of the United States. Registration, which means documentation. Prior notice, you have to let people know, the United States know, specifically FDA, if FDA is your regulating agency. And administrative. Administrative means that we can, or FDA can now detain your products more quicker with ease. With that, also, don't get bogged down with a lot of the processes. You don't get bogged down with paralysis of analysis. Start your business and learn as you go, but have this information that you're going to need this type of information, but don't let it freeze you in place. With that, let me turn it over to David Scully.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I jump into TRQs, or tariff rate quotas, let me give a larger perspective on why they're important. Sorry? Louder, okay. I always have a problem with that. Okay. Is this better? Okay. Why they're important? Well, AGOA is a preferential trade agreement, and what AGOA does is provide duty-free access for lots, not all, products from sub-Saharan Africa or from AGOA countries to the United States. There's some exceptions, however, and it's always the exceptions that are important and interesting. And one subset of these exceptions are tariff rate quotas, or I should say is tariff rate quotas. So that's why we're looking at them, why they're of interest. Not all of them are important for AGOA, but some of them are very important. So that's what I tried to do in the paper we have outside. The paper has three parts. I talk about what is a TRQ. Logically, you have to explain what it is. I talk about which ones matter for AGOA countries, and that's the largest part of my paper. I go through commodity by commodity. That's not what I'm going to talk about today in my talk. I'm going to skip over that fairly quickly, and I'm going to focus on the third point, which is what can the U.S. do to do something to the TRQs, modify them, change them, abolish them, whatever, to allow more market access for AGOA countries for those TRQ commodities that matter for AGOA. Okay, so I'm going to focus on that last part. So what is a TRQ? What's a tariff rate quota? Well, if you've ever paid U.S. income tax, or income tax in other countries probably, you've looked at tax brackets. And that's basically what a TRQ is. It allows a certain volume, I just put up 2,000 metric tons here, of imports at a low tax, at a low tariff, and then when you hit that barrier, the tax goes up to the next rate. There's only two levels. For most commodities, for almost all commodities for AGOA, the in-quota tariff, the low tariff, is 0. So you can bring in duty-free, and then you hit the wall, you hit a high tariff. Now, how does this differ from a regular old quota? The difference is that, in theory, you could always import something by paying the over-quota tariff, that high tariff. In fact, for a lot of the TRQs, that over-quota tariff is extremely high, and you'd be crazy to pay the tax to bring the product in. So it's in those cases, it's very much like an absolute quota. The legal distinction is that, in theory, you could bring it in. An absolute quota, there's no way you could bring it in. So that's really what a TRQ is. Now, there's another component of a TRQ, which is who gets to bring in that 2,000 metric tons, or whatever the limited amount is at the low tax rate. It's a rationing problem, and there are lots of ways of rationing things. If you have a popular concert coming to town, you could say, fine, people camp out overnight to be the first in line to buy the ticket. This is a first-come, first-served system. If you show up late, you don't get in. It's like a salad bar. There's only Jell-O left at the end of if you show up late for the luncheon. Salmon's all gone. So you have to be first in those cases. There are other systems where it's dealt out to people who were trading before the quota was imposed. We have a lot that are like that. So they're given to the exporting countries. In cheese, there's a bunch of quotas that are given to particular firms in the United States that used to be importing, and they're allowed to keep that privilege, or other people are excluded. So it varies from commodity to commodity and style. They all have their weird personalities. There are a lot of stories, and I've told a few of them in my paper. Okay. What are the TRQs the United States have? This is the universe of TRQs. There are 46 separate tariff rate quotas. They cover 196 tariff lines, or different tariff products. Real quick, tobacco for cigarettes. This is an important one for AGOA. There's one TRQ, and it covers 9 tariff lines. The tariff lines are for things like for cigarette tobacco. One tariff line would be for leaf, full leaf. The next one would be for leaf with stem removed, chopped but not shredded, shredded but not chopped, and so forth. So different levels of processing of tobacco leaf for tobacco for cigarettes. If you look at the far line there, this is the over-quota tariff. And please look at the tobacco for cigarettes over-quota tariff, 350%. This is the highest tariff in the entire U.S. tariff schedule, which is over 10,000 lines. This tariff is meant, it's not a tax. They know nothing is going to come in at that tax rate. That is to keep out product. They don't want it coming in over that level. And the other ones are also very high. Sugar and sugar-containing products is a specific tariff. So what I've done there, I've shown the range that's been for recent years. It's about 30 cents a kilo. And depending on what the price is, the tariff goes up and down in percentage terms. There are 2 relatively low tariffs in terms of this table up here, cotton and beef. But when you think about those tariffs in terms of the U.S. entire schedule, those are extremely high. Only 2% of tariffs in the United States are over 25%. So we're looking at everything here is over in the 98th or 100th percentile of very high tariffs. Okay? So of these, which ones matter for AGOA? I'm going to spend very little time on this slide. Okay? It's mainly in the paper. But it's easy to summarize. Sugar and sugar-containing products, very important. Included in this are cocoa products that contain sugar. So those are important. Tobacco for cigarettes is important. Peanuts, peanut butter and paste is sometimes important. There's been a reform of the peanut program, so this is less profitable than it used to be. Cotton is probably not that important because the U.S. exports a lot of cotton. It rarely imports anything. Beef has not been binding on AGOA countries, and dairy products, in general, AGOA countries don't have a surplus of butter, fat, and dairy products to export, so it's probably not that important. It could be, but it's probably not. So that's sort of the overview of these.
Clarification, please.
Yeah.
Probably a dumb question, but what is, if it starts at 0 for the tariff, what is the percentage rate? Percentage of what? 24% of what? 350% of what?
Oh, of the value. If it's a percentage, if the tariff is a percentage, it's of the value of that product coming in. So if you have a $2 cheese and you have a 25% tariff, the tariff would be 50 cents. Okay? Ma'am?
What about the duty tariff-free zones? Don't they have tax on those?
I don't know. What about the duty tariff-free zones? I'm not sure how that fits in, but I don't think this works for the TRQ commodities. I'd be very, very surprised. I think that's more for apparel and textiles, if it matters. Yes, okay.
Clarification on cotton.
Cotton, yes.
This is no longer important.
No longer important in that the U.S. is a huge cotton exporter. And my question is, why do we even have the tariff rate quota on cotton? It doesn't really make much sense. The cotton, some of these were set up in the 1950s when we had completely different agricultural policies, and you needed to keep out the products from coming in. Otherwise, it would disturb the price supports. But those systems have been gone. In the case of cotton, they've been gone for 25 years. So they just haven't removed this tariff rate quota. It's just there. It's a remnant of the past. And a lot of them are like that. They don't really serve much purpose any longer. Okay? Okay. What can we do? If we look just at tariffs, all but 29 of the in-quota tariffs are duty-free. And 25 of those are for sugar-containing products that are not possible to import in quota. It's a long story. That leaves only 4 tariff lines that could be reduced. And I think they should be for those 4 cotton lines. But that's it. 4 in-quota cotton lines. The over-quota tariff is a problem because the law says you cannot reduce it. So if we just stick to tariffs, we can't do much. There's only 4 cotton lines. So we have to look at the way TRQs are allocated, how it's rationed. Here's the cigarette TRQ. And what I want you to look at is up at the 12 o'clock here, at the purple sliver. That is all of the countries. Malawi and Zimbabwe have an allocation of about 12,000 metric tons. All other countries in the world, except the ones listed here, are crammed into that 3,000 metric tons at the top. And this is a problem. Like I said, you have to come in first come, first served. And it's not predictable who gets in that 3,000 metric tons year to year. Sometimes it's Korea, Croatia, Kenya. You don't know. And if you're a tobacco buyer looking to import, if you don't have a TRQ, a reliable way of getting in, you're just not going to be interested in trying to import from that country. It's just too risky. And there are a lot of countries in Africa that produce tobacco that could come, and they can't. So what can you do about it? Well, this is another way of looking at it. The TRQ is this, the 3,000 is this little purple strip at the bottom. This is all the other TRQ that's allocated to other countries, and a lot of it is not filled. Some of it goes unused. So the question is it possible to reallocate this to AGOA? Originally, I thought it would be very difficult, but if you look at the law, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the president can reallocate TRQs any way he wants to. The problem is the U.S. has WTO obligations, And some of these slices have been given out to countries. If we took it back from them, they would complain. There would be a WTO case about that. So I was pessimistic about this because we normally see once the tariffs have been allocated to people, they stay that way for 30, 40, 50 years. They do not change. But people who read my paper said, David, you're really being pessimistic about this. People might voluntarily surrender, countries might voluntarily surrender some of their quota for AGOA. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. So let's look at an optimistic scenario about this. Let's just suppose, this is just suppose, that Brazil and EU, Brazil has the largest share, suppose they just donated 10% of their quota to AGOA. It's not crazy. They might do it. This is in their foreign policy interest to do it. There would be other ways of doing it. But you could probably go around and get 5,000 to 10,000 metric tons of free quota and set it up for an AGOA-only allocation. And that would solve a lot of those problems. I'd say let Malawi, and Zimbabwe's not an AGOA country at the moment, but let Malawi fill its quota first and not bump everyone else out. But this would leave space for Mozambique, Uganda, Zambia to get in there, get some of that market. It's not duty-free, quota-free, but it's a big improvement. It's more than what we have at the moment. So that's one way to do it. We know that we can do it under U.S. law. This would not be problems for the WTO because there's a WTO waiver that would allow this. So this can be done under current legislation. Okay. If that won't work, there's another proposal here. It would probably require new language in the legislation, but you create an additional TRQ for AGOA only. We do this for foreign free trade arrangements with free trade partners. So countries like Bahrain and Oman, where the U.S. has a free trade agreement, we've set up a small TRQ for them. They're usually pretty small. With AGOA, you'd want to have a fairly large one. But that would require a small change in legislation. So let me go to my final slide here, which summarizes everything. And I'm in the time zone. Under current law, reduce the in-quota tariffs that have not already been reduced to duty-free. And that's basically 4 tariff lines for cotton. Look into reallocating the pie. See if we can get donations from people and create an AGOA-only TRQ. That would do it. Changing the law would be coming up with a law that would allow the president or USTR to provide duty-free, quota-free access for the overquota tariff. That can't be done in the law at the moment. And look at creating this additional slice, such as we do for our free trade agreement partners. And that's what I have. Thank you.
Are you duly frightened? Don't be, because you can do this, especially now with the information you're gaining sitting here, because you know what you need to do, where to go, and who to ask. With that, Craig Fitchop.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I guess, yeah, it's good afternoon already. Yeah. I don't know. I'm in a completely different time zone. It probably will be that way for a couple of days. I just came back yesterday. But a lot of you probably won't be able to see this, but it's very important. And I just want to say that anytime you get a diagram like this to explain the ease of the regulatory rulemaking process, you need to know a few resources. I'm a resource. I don't get a lot of time to talk. I could talk about this all day long because it's important. It's confusing. I brought a bunch of business cards. If you need more information, just come up to me after this and I'll give you a business card with somebody else's phone number. But we import $73 billion of agricultural products last year. We imported from around the world. So apparently, despite the onerous undertakings that exporting to the United States involves, it's being done, and actually it's being done by countries from around the world. So yes, it's a daunting process. It's a time-eating process, and it's a complicated process. But there's one phrase that I really need you to remember, that despite the clear-cut approach that APHIS takes to our process of getting things in, and it actually is, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I can't underscore that enough. if you make noise, if you make use of your professional business people who come to Washington to speak with the administration officials about your particular product, your particular commodity that you want to export, if you talk to the regulatory officials, 9 times out of 10, somebody's going to have to jump through hoops to make things move. If your ambassador seeks to meet with the administrator of my agency to discuss, what's happening with our, export of spices, or greens to the United States, what's going on with that? The administrator's not going to know.
Could you repeat that?
Okay. No problem, no problem. Squeaky wheel gets the grease. The top guy at the top of the pyramid, top man or woman, isn't going to know all the details, but if an ambassador from a foreign country is coming in to find out what's happening with their particular commodity that they want to export to the U.S., people are going to be jumping through hoops to either A, make things done, or find out what's going on. At the same time, it's important and incumbent upon you as an exporting country to have your act together as well. And I know that we heard about Zambia taking a long time. Part of that was just communications. A lot of times countries assume that they've, said they want to request things, and then 5 years later they come back and say, hey, what's going on? Well, we need the following information from you. And it just happens to be extensive, and you haven't provided it for us, so we sort of let things sit. And yeah, we're actively working on 113 risk assessments right now, but there are about 250 risk assessment requests, and we're not working on the rest of them because we haven't heard from the countries in terms of responses to letters. Sometimes that's due to political reasons, sometimes that's just due to lack of resources to answer. Sometimes there are no answers to the questions we're asking, and that's where we need to work together. So I'm going to do this quickly, but again, I want to underscore, I've got a longer presentation that I'll email somebody so it'll be available to you guys. But our import requirements basically consist of a phytosanitary certificate, and that's a certificate that's attested to that by your National Plant Protection Organization, which would be the equivalent to my agency, which would document that the shipment is free of whatever injurious pest or disease that we have determined it needs to be free of through either the absence or having been mitigated by some sort of a treatment. Another big one, and this ties into some crazy things that have happened in the past, there needs to be a reasonable time period between the inspection, the issuance of the phytosanitary certificate, and the time of export. So a person at a port who gets a phytosanitary certificate that was issued, say, in 1995 on a product coming in 2010, obviously is going to have some questions, and it's probably illegitimate. I said it needs to be free of diseases, insects, and weed seeds. Those are important. Packaging has to be done in such a specific way that it meets our requirements. There are treatments that may be required. Need an import permit, and then if it's going to be re-exported to another country, you need to have some transiting requirements met as well. So, the APHIS mission is really based on protecting U.S. agriculture, but protecting U.S. agriculture includes obviously dealing with trade. And, a lot of times it is unfair in many respects, but a lot of it is based on the fact that we need to protect our domestic agriculture. We feed ourselves as other countries do, and it's based on very specific principles embodied in the agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which is a component of the World Trade Organization agreements. And the shorthand for this is the SPS agreement. And the principles inherent in that agreement that we try to follow are transparency. That's about our process. Yes, it's a convoluted chart, but anybody can be engaged in that process from beginning to end, and we encourage our foreign trade partners to be engaged in that process. Harmonization. Where international standards exist, We attempt to be consistent with those standards. If we need to exceed those standards in any specific way, we have to justify it scientifically. If there's an opportunity for an equivalent treatment that meets our needs, and this is often used in the animal health area and in exports, where we would recognize another country's food safety system as being equivalent to ours. Things might be done differently, but it provides an equivalent level of protection. Risk assessments. If you have to throw up a protective measure, you have to be able to justify it scientifically. How is that done? Through a risk assessment. And then whenever possible, we attempt to use regionalization to allow imports into the United States from areas that may be free of an injurious pest or disease, even though the rest of the country may have those problems. So, that being said, that's pretty much what our requirements are. But beyond that, we have the process that's involved. And the first phase that was on that scene is, if there's a new commodity your country wants to export to the United States, and if we have ascertained that any dangerous pests or diseases can be handled by existing mitigations, then we go through a notice-based rulemaking process. Very short, very concise, still involves being able to have a risk assessment which is available and published for the whole world to see and comment on. And that takes a short amount of time, because after that we simply publish a notice allowing the process in. If it's a new commodity that we've never imported before with new pests and diseases for which there are no existing mitigations, then we have to go through the risk assessment process. And there is a component of the Federal Register, it's Chapter 7 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 319.5, which clearly articulates what our expectations are from foreign countries with regard to what we need in order to go through the risk assessment process. After that's done, and as we've heard, it can take some time. Generally, and this is a rule of thumb, and this is based on my experience, we might be working on 113 risk assessments right now. We'll probably finish between 15 to 25. Which 15 to 25 get done? Squeaky wheel gets the grease, okay? Information moves it along. Harassing people, even though I'm not supposed to say that, and most of the people who do the risk assessments will hate me for this, but I tell everybody, if you keep hammering away once a month, hey, how's the risk assessment coming? Can we do anything to help? You're going to move your issue forward. And then once that's done, you go through the regulatory process, the proposed rule. Everybody can comment on it. Again, you put the proposed rule out. I'm not sure exactly how many rules we publish each year, but I do know, again, the import trade-related rules are competing with any number of other rules that are going to be out and about. So you've got to be aware of that. So the bottom line is, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but there are opportunities to work with APHIS in other areas. One is for plant-related products, working with the IPPC. The IPPC, for the first time ever, is going to have a working group on capacity building. I have been appointed to represent the U.S. on this group. Also, there are two other standard-setting organizations, the OIE for animal health-related issues and the Codex Alimentarius Commission for food safety issues. But the bottom line is know what you're doing with your commodity, and despite all of this stuff that I've told you today, you can go through this whole process, you can work hard at it, you can have an elaborate setup in your country to prepare to export to the United States, but if you don't have anybody to export to or to buy the product, it's a waste of your time and a waste of your money. So I'll be here for a little bit, I'll have cards. I want to encourage you to, if you really have questions, I might not be able to answer them today, but I am a resource. I know the people who work on Africa. I know the people who work on risk assessments. Don't miss the opportunity to at least establish preliminary contacts. So thank you very much for your attention, and I appreciate your help.
We're going to open it up for some questions. Okay. Just remember, nobody cares about your product but you. Craig is going to have a stack of papers to go through, and your product is right in the middle or near the bottom. But if you keep calling him, he's going to put it on the top. Nobody cares about your product but you. Make sure your brokers know what they're doing. If your brokers don't know what to do if your product is detained, you're in trouble. Okay, one more thing about equivalency. Craig mentioned that you have to have a USDA equivalent component in your country. Try to find out who that is and where that is, because they have to have similar rules in order to issue these certificates. So find that out, as well as knowing who's responsible for your product. Let me open it up for a couple of questions. Yes, sir. Oh, there's Mike right here.
Hi, Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. Very quick, because I think there's more people interested in how do you do something than how do you change a law. I found that the two presentations by Mr. Pasco and Mr. Scully were excellent. As you know, many of us are focusing on the AGOA product review, which is being taken care of within Congress. I like the idea, as somebody said, wake-up call to require USDA, I hate to say this to Craig, but to respond, or at least Congress informed every 6 months of what's happening with an African presentation. That can give it the priority. I like the idea of Mr. Scully to take that area, which we saw the unused quota allocation, and maybe switch that around to the African countries, because it's better than it just going to waste. You can give them security. Quick note on sugar, for example. We're so short of sugar now, we are importing sugar, but according to the quota allocation, perhaps using the AGOA waiver and other things, we can give that to Africa. Other than that, I'll say nothing more. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I think mine is just an addition or an add-on to what. My name is Elizabeth Sichenga, and I'm representing NGOCC Zambia. And when you were doing the presentation on TRQs, I was amazed that the three major products that you're talking about was sugar, tobacco, and peanuts. Mm-hmm. And Zambia is one of the major producers of those, and they've been looking for a market. One of the major markets is UK and the SADC states and the EU. And they have been trying to penetrate America, and they have failed. Where are the roadblocks?
Well, the TRQs are the roadblocks. Clearly in tobacco, the story I explained applies directly to Zambia. The similar story in the paper is about peanuts. Most of the TRQ for peanuts is allocated to Argentina. It's the largest exporter in the world. And about 20% of it is to all other countries. So the same problem occurs there. There's a rush, and it's very hard to get in. Most of it's coming in from China. And with sugar, the sugar TRQ is fully allocated, and it's really hard to get in. That is a mess, and that's hard to do. I do want to have a footnote here. For the papers, we have a website. It's www. We can get them in PDF. It's www.agritrade, AGRITRADE, one word, .org. So if you go there, okay, www.agritrade.org. And Rick's paper and my paper are there, along with other resources. Okay, AGRITRADE. Agri-trade, sorry.
We'll go for two more questions, and then we'll call it a day. Let's begin over at that end.
Just a comment. Daniel Karanja with the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa. The papers are outside. Copies of the papers, the two papers are outside.
Oh.
Jonas Kefle from Ethiopia, GTDC. My question is about U.S. government subsidy for U.S. farmers. Is that an obstacle for African exporters? And are there any preferred products, agricultural products, or any products that are not, that the U.S. government would encourage to come from Africa? Like tomato is saturated, but are there some products for which there is a great demand that you can share with us?
Yeah, first of all, about the agricultural subsidies. U.S. has subsidies on corn, cotton, rice, feed grains, wheat. It does not have subsidies on fruits and vegetables, so I think that's good for AGOA countries that want to try to export here. I can't claim to be an expert on what commodities would sell in the U.S., but I think if you track recent applications, there's a request from Israel for eggplants, so maybe eggplants is a really good one. But I think there are people that probably know that, but I couldn't comment on what the best products are, fortunately.
Yeah, I'd just echo, really it's an issue of understanding the market. That's not something, there are people who assess and analyze in the government, what's popular and what's not, but really that's really a marketing-based type of a thing where you'd have to see what the markets are, and I would suspect that in some instances there may be country-specific or regional-specific types of products for which the initial spot for bringing them in would be to those areas where there's a high population of those types of people. Recently, we're importing a lot of mangoes initially from India, and they were all bought up by Indian communities and Indian grocers and things like that, and that's really the first place to get a foothold. So, again, it involves marketing research. As far as the subsidies go, I really, it would be inappropriate for me to speak to that, but I think, again, Americans generally are open to trying new things. Salsa is now the leading condiment. It's overtaking ketchup, things like that. So, it's not something that can't be overcome, and the market's pretty large, and if the economy keeps improving, it will continue to expand, and there's, I think, enough available for everyone. $73 billion in imports last year is a really big number, and so again, I wouldn't be discouraged, but really know where you want to go with the market.
I'd add on that, and I agree with both comments. Looking at peanuts, looking at the peanut trade data, what we see in the TRQ is you have peanuts in the shell, shelled peanuts, blanched peanuts, and then also processed peanut products, not like candy, but peanuts that are in hot sauce, or peanuts that have been baked in coconut, and things like that. A lot of those are coming in from Southeast Asian countries. Some of them even pay the tariff to come in, and it's very much the same thing. You have ethnic markets in the U.S., people want stuff from home, and those things can expand. So that's one thing to look at. If you're trying to just sell the commodity, it's really rough. If you can differentiate it, with something special, that will work, or can work.
Well, we want to. Go ahead, and then we close with this comment.
Thank you. I can't help myself. Charlotte Hebebrand from IPC. I want to respond to that question on subsidies because I'm not working for the U.S. government, so I think I can speak a little bit more freely, perhaps. The big subsidy question for Africa, of course, has been cotton subsidies, and I think David pointed out that the cotton TRQ is really not the issue. Africans needn't be worried about that because there's no market for African cotton in the U.S. There's plenty of cotton here, and in fact, the U.S. exports. The problem are the subsidies, because what's happened over time is that subsidies to U.S. cotton producers have had a price-depressing effect on world prices. So there's plenty of demand, actually, for African cotton. I mean, China is importing like crazy. It's sucking up cotton. But what has happened as a result of the subsidies is that the price of cotton has been lowered. So that is a big issue. And I would just add to that, there was a WTO case brought by Brazil against the U.S. I'm sure many of you are aware of that. The U.S. was found to be in violation of its WTO disciplines, obligations, and an interesting settlement has emerged between the Brazilians and the U.S., where in essence the U.S. does not have to change its subsidy regime. It has promised to do so in the context of the next Farm Bill, which is probably reasonable because it would be very difficult to single out cotton subsidies. But in the meantime, it has agreed to pay some money to the Brazilian cotton producers in order to, sort of keep them happy until the program is changed, if it is ever changed. I just want to add, Africa was not part of the WTO dispute. Africa was not part of that settlement. And now, really, one could argue that those payments are subsidizing Brazilian cotton producers. So the end result for Africa is not great on cotton.
Just one quick comment, and then we'll let everybody go and eat to their heart's delight.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, with reference to WTO cases, since I've been involved in them, you can get results, and they are binding results, but they cost a lot of money, they take a lot of time, and even if you win your case, and this is a perfect example, you might not get the change that you intended, because in this case, the U.S. is just paying out money, much the same as the European Union has been hit with additional tariffs after losing a beef hormones case. So they cost an awful lot of money because there's a lot of engagement in Geneva at the WTO, and they do take at least 2 to 4 years to get to some sort of a resolution.
Just can I add one thing? The EU did change its sugar regime based on a WTO complaint. So the EU now provides 100% duty-free, quota-free for all commodities.
Yeah.
Lunch is served right across the hall. Everybody's invited. Please join me in applauding the expert panelists.